It's not new. It's not anything you haven't seen before, but today we're ranking the 16 types from most emotional to least emotional. So let's get into this one today. So we got the list back. We got S tier, we got sensitive, we got A, decent amount, B, balanced, C, cool and collected. That wasn't very cool and collected. D, dead inside. I'm not quite sure why I made the letters integrate into the words, but it is what it is. Not gonna happen again. So yeah, so let's get into it here. We're gonna start with ESTPs. ESTPs on an emotional scale, they got FE child, FI trickster, so third slot. I'm gonna say cool and collected. ESTPs, they're keeping it cool and collected, but they can get emotional, especially when it comes to positive emotions. Negative emotions, not so much, because they have optimistic feeling functions. But ESTPs, they see someone happy, they make someone smile, they're gonna feel good, have those good feelings. Definitely cool and collected, though. They like to focus on the truth. They can be pretty pragmatic, to the point, say the truth, not gonna necessarily mince words. Pretty direct there, and showing emotion here and there, but not necessarily going crazy emotional, but not completely shutting them out. Can feel positive emotions, can definitely like discussing them occasionally. Then we've got ISTP. So ISTP's fourth function for feeling, FE aspirational. They are trying to be more emotional, but FI demon. So quite, I would say, dead inside when it comes to ISTPs. Now, this is with a caveat with all these personality types that we'll get into when it comes to nurture and how that works. But ISTPs, FI demon, can be pretty pessimistic, pretty low when it comes to feelings. Not going to be feeling a ton of emotions inside. They got SI critic as well, so negative when it comes to reactions as well. So just relatively not feeling emotions, but they do have that FE aspirational, so when they get into it and they're able to say something they think that helps someone, makes someone feel good, they're going to feel good about that. They are going to have those emotions, but relatively low on the emotional scale on a day-to-day basis. ESFPs, they got FI parent. They got the high feeling function. But that being said, when it comes to A or S, they do have a little bit lower feeling in some of the types. That being said, they got some pessimistic feelings, so they can be pretty sensitive as well when it comes to things. So I'm going to put them in the sensitive category. I think that ESFPs, they have that pessimistic FI parent, and they can't get their feelings hurt. They don't want somebody to insult them. They can be pretty worried about having their emotions tampered with because they can fluctuate in great ways. Like ESFPs, they can have these really high emotional highs with having so much feeling in their cognitive function stack, but they can also have a lot of lows because it's a parent function. It's a little pessimistic, so they can swing. A lot of mood swings for ESFPs, very high highs and low lows, relatively sensitive, I would say. ISFPs, I'm going to put them in that category as well. ISFPs are pretty sensitive. They have FI hero. They feel a lot. They interact with the world a lot with their emotions. They want to connect to others. They want to feel a connection to themselves. A lot of emotion coming from FI hero. And so I'd say ISFPs definitely like to connect with the world on an emotional level. So I would say pretty sensitive. One way they're a little less sensitive than ESFPs is they do have fully optimistic FI, which means they can be kind of tough in a lot of ways. If things are, if there's jokes being made about them, they can ride that out because they just kind of feel good about themselves. They're just kind of vibing. So in some ways, you could argue to put them a little bit lower. I might change the list as we go, just doing it on the fly, but I think ISFPs, they can be pretty, emotionally sensitive. That being said, they can also be pretty emotionally enduring because they have really optimistic feelings. They can kind of push through it too, even if they feel sensitive sometimes. ESTJs are more sensitive than people think, but, they still have FI in that 4th slot. Generally try to cut out the emotions, but I think ESTJs are much more emotional than people think. I'm going to say a decent amount. They have that pessimistic FI in that 4th slot. They're really kind of scared of having their feelings hurt. They can get pretty emotionally involved, whether they're, in a manager position and they're telling people what to do all the time. And, they can be pretty sensitive. I think people think they're like, ooh, cool and collected. They don't care. But that's just because they're mean to other people. They might just say what they think. They might not necessarily care. But I promise you, I'm going full screen for this, hit them back where it hurts. If you say it back to an ESTJ, they will crumble. ESTJs are pretty emotional. They can be pretty scared of having their feelings hurt. All you got to do is give it back to an ESTJ and they're going to stop because that's mutually assured destruction. ESTJs do not like to have their feelings hurt. They might look like it by, stomping on other people's feelings, but it's all coming from an insecure place if they're doing that. Not all ESTJs are immature, of course, but I promise you, they're probably more sensitive than you are. It's like the is that a wolf or a bear? I don't know. They're more scared of you than you are of them. If you think about it. Okay, ISTJs. ISTJs are fairly emotional, but they got that FI child slot. So while they can be pretty emotional, let their feelings affect them, they can ride it out. They can be pretty optimistic about their emotions. I'm gonna put them. Ooh. You know, honestly, I know this might be controversial, and this is how you kind of, you know, it's how you rate emotions. Internal emotions, external emotions. We'll get into the FE types in a second here. ISTJs, they do have FI child. They can be pretty sensitive. You know, they're not going to necessarily seem emotional because, quote unquote, emotional because they're, you know, not necessarily saying nice things. They don't seem to care. But a lot of that comes from, oh, look at the voice crack. A lot of that comes from an emotional place because they, you know, they're, you know, don't want to make other people feel good, and they have all these ego investments. So they can be pretty emotional if they're in an immature state like that. I think they're more emotional than people think. I might change that rating though. ESFJs, this one's everyone's gonna say super sensitive, super emotional. I don't know about that. Honestly, because they do have FE hero, so they like to make people feel good and stuff, and they have FI nemesis, so they have a lot of feelings as well, a lot of kind of pessimistic feelings. I'm gonna put them in the decent amount, but you know, they don't have FI themselves, so they can take a hit or two and kind of not care about their feelings. They're compatible with people without FE. I'm gonna say they're, you know, reasonably sensitive, but not as sensitive as people might think. I wouldn't even put them in the A tier. And we've got ISFJs. ISFJs, you know, they can be sensitive. They want to avoid conflict. They don't want to ruffle feathers too much unnecessarily, but at the same time, you know, they can make jokes. They're not necessarily going to be super sensitive. They do have FE parent, FI critic. So while they are a feeling type, they're one of the least feeling of the feeling types when it comes to a lot of things. They're more pragmatic about the feelings, where they like don't want to hurt people because it'll give them a better experience, but they're not always going out of their way to be a bleeding heart. There's a pretty reasonable balance, I would say, for ISFJs. I think ISFJs, depending on their development, could even go into the lower categories, but potentially ISFJ, who's more focused on their feeling functions, could go higher too. So this one is word of the year, fluctuating between these, I would say. So B seems fair to me. ENTPs, ooh. Yeah, I'm gonna put them in the cool and collected generally. Same as ESTPs, FE child. They like to attach to positive feelings. They'll be generous. They like to have a good vibe, but they're not gonna be super, you know, emotional all the time. Although FE child can be more emotional than you think when it comes to fighting for causes, caring about, you know, global issues. That being said, they're not gonna be super sensitive about things. They're gonna be reasonably cool and collected. Doesn't mean they're not, you know, emotional or not a good person. That's not what this list is about, but generally they can stuff their emotions down and kind of just think about the facts, think logically about things, and not necessarily be too overly emotional about it. But you know, still a little bit, and it can come and go. INTPs, also FI demon. I'm gonna put them on the dead inside list because of that, you know, FI demon, anti-critic, feeling hopeless. They can definitely have that feeling of being dead inside. Of course they're not, but this is how they're going to feel emotionally, unless they're, you know, bonding with other people. And when they're extroverting, they can feel some emotion attaching to other people a little bit more, but relatively dead inside when they're alone because they have that FI demon. Just not going to want to feel things. If it's feeling things, it's negative. So it's not that they can't feel negative emotions. They definitely can feel negative emotions. It's just they're going to sometimes stuff them down, try not to feel too much, and kind of block those emotions out. And we've got ENTJs. ENTJs, more emotional than you think. Once again, same with the TJs. You know, they seem unemotional because they just don't care how people feel. That doesn't mean they don't care how they feel. And if you know, give that energy back, they're going to feel upset. And so I would say that ENTJs can be more emotional than you think. That being said, I would say because they're not affiliative, ESTJs can, you know, really get attached to others. ENTJs can be a bit more pragmatic, not care. So I'm going to say that they're a little less emotional than that ESTJ level. That being said, I think that ENTJs do have FI. They do have pessimistic FI, which can make them kind of up and down emotionally, and that can definitely affect it. I think people think that they're unemotional, but I think they're more emotional than people think, and they're kind of balanced between facts, research, you know, being pragmatic, of course, being very independent and kind of efficient, and then also they can get their feelings hurt. They don't want to be disrespected. They don't want to be insulted. They can get emotional about things. So I'm going to say a relative balance there, a little bit more than people probably think. INTJs. INTJs also more emotional than people think. If you have any experience with INTJs, you'll know they like making jokes. They like cracking things. They don't want jokes made about them. They can get real sensitive real fast. I'm just going to tell it like it is. INTJs can get pretty sensitive. More than they want you to think, but more than, you know, TJs, that's just the way it works. TJs can dish it, but they don't want to take it. And if you give it back to an INTJ, they'll shut down real quick. More than some of these other types that are a little lower. Low FI types. Oh, where's my mouse? We got a mouse glitch. More than other types. So FI types that are a little bit, you know, lower down, I think are going to just ignore those things, ignore the insults, ignore the feelings. Whereas, you know, FI child, it still wants to feel good about itself. It's going to be more emotional than you think. So, but relative balance, they're not extremely sensitive. They're not, you know, necessarily connecting with things emotionally all the time, but they definitely can more than I think people will even know. ENFPs, I would say pretty sensitive personality type, FI high. You know, INFPs are probably going to go in the same category. We can talk about that too. INFPs and ENFPs. ENFPs, FI parent. Insecure feelings. They can definitely have those highs and lows like ESFPs have. Those big mood swings. Lots of emotions, especially when young. So I think gonna fall into the pretty emotional category, especially because they're idealistic and people focused and affiliate if they want, you know, approval. They want all these things. And so they can definitely be upset if those things don't go well. So I'm going to say pretty emotional. INFPs, I'm gonna say S tier probably as well. I think that INFPs can be pretty sensitive. That's their reputation, which maybe isn't, you know, it's maybe overblown compared to how, you know, sensitive we all are. But INFPs can definitely be emotional. They have FI hero. They have all those feeling functions really high up. So they're going to feel a lot of things. They're going to take what people say and emotionally apply it to themselves. So if I say an opinion about, well, even right now, about INFPs, how does that make me feel? Do I feel like that boosts my self-worth and makes me feel good about myself and my identity and aligns with my authentic, you know, feeling about who I am? Or is that clash with it? And then they're going to feel bad. And the way this works with all these sensitive types with NFPs, finding out how things align with their identity. So they're trying to find out, how do things align with them emotionally? You know, does this, you know, make me feel good about myself? If it doesn't, maybe I'm not going to do it. Does this person make me feel good about myself? If not, I'm not going to spend time with them. So they're trying to find those relationships, find those connections that boost their life, make them happier. And so it's kind of a pursuit of happiness. That's how all the sensitivity works. The lower down types are actually going to have a hard time sometimes having that pursuit of happiness because they're being too self-sacrificing or selfless or ignoring their emotions or being self-destructive, because that pursuit of happiness, that sensitivity can actually really help them find environments which are healthy. So that's kind of a way it works. People think maybe, oh, you're emotional, you're always going to be upset, this and that. It's not really how it works. Emotions guide you towards what they're trying to tell you. If an emotion's trying to tell you a behavior is bad or unethical or wrong, then you're going to go away from that and you're going to make your life and other people's lives better. So you can use these emotions as a compass, as a guiding force to actually have a happier life. And so these lower types, these TPs, can actually struggle in life, not necessarily esteeming themselves, not necessarily believing in themselves. They may put themselves down. They may put others on a pedestal. There can be a lot of problems with not even having that sensitivity. So we've got ENFJs. ENFJs, same thing, feeling hero. But I'm going to put them a little lower. One thing that holds it back from the absolute top tier sensitivity category is they're not an FI user. They do care about the facts. They are going to be self-critical all the time, but they're not necessarily going to be overly sensitive when people are rude to them. They can brush it off and just try and be nice and ignore it. And they will feel hurt. Yes, they have high enough FI. It will hurt their feelings, but they can still be with people who aren't necessarily the most sensitive and caring personality types. That's who they're compatible with. So while they are sensitive a reasonable amount, they're not going to be the most sensitive personality type. They are going to be able to take things on the chin, look at them pragmatically, think them through, and be kind of rational about them without necessarily being overly emotional, because they do have a little bit lower FI than TI. So INFJs, I'm going to say probably in the balance category. I think they're probably in that middle category. I'm not sure if I distributed these all in the best way, but INFJs, you know, they're going to be fairly emotional when they feel guilty, when they're being hard on themselves, when they're feeling bad about themselves. Of course, that's kind of infamous, but I would say they're not the most sensitive ever. You know, they have a lot of negative, pessimistic feelings. Sometimes they can feel that positive feelings if it's attaching to the external world. So if it's seeing others who are happy, seeing others who have been helped by them, they can feel that half positive emotion as well. but generally negative, generally guilty, generally ashamed, bad feelings. That's going to dip them down. But then they're still an optimistic TI user, so they're mostly just thinking. They're still an optimistic NI user, so they're mostly thinking about their future. They're not always going to be reveling in their feelings in their past. That's a loop that's very negative for them, and that is going to happen, but not as much as some other types. So I'm going to put them in a balance category. I think INFJs are known as the most thinking of the feeling types in some way. Some people think that. And that's going to kind of lower them down on my list, I would say. Still, emotional, still people focused, still idealistic, still wanting to help, still emotionally attached for sure, but they can ignore their own emotions. They can take it on the chin. They can think logically. Not that these other types can't. It's just a primary thing for them. INFJs primarily thinking logically, whereas the FP types in the sensitive category are going to think morally, ethically, rationally, all these different ways before they're going really logically and just looking at that truth objectively. They're going to feel it subjectively. And then STJs and, these TJ types, they still have FI. They still have these emotions that they're processing first. And so it's really when you get to the high TI users that you get a little bit less emotionality, really low FI, just processing things objectively. But I think this is obviously a nuanced thing. I think with, here, I'll go full screen here. I think with some of the types, how do you rate emotionality? You could rate it as sensitivity with emotion, which is obviously the obvious way to do it. But you could also rate it in other ways, like experience, hope, fear, all these different things. But that's a little bit of a complicated way to do it, and that's maybe for a list for another time. I think that this will probably wrap it up. If you guys enjoyed, please leave a like down below and a comment as well, and subscribe as it really helps the channel. Let me know what list you want me to do next and what you think about this list. If you agree, if you disagree, and why. I'd like to hear it. I think you could make pretty good arguments for these moving around. And yeah, I'd like to hear them. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time, and have a great day.